They're a group of black Indians
that created the largest haven in the U.S. for escaped slaves.
Told you, this is the true story of the black Seminoles.
They were the strongest alive. They were ready to die to live. You can never find this taught in school because they were so historically unbelievable. Imagine the pain, escaping slavery, the hunger, the thirst, the long trek to safety called the Trail of Tears. The resolved determination for mutual respect, equality, and freedom. And they'd rather die to get there. That's the incredible story of the Black Seminoles. They were warriors of freedom, a cornerstone of a unique culture that historically defied the American predatory foundation for all time. Known as the Black Seminoles or Seminole Freedmen, these were a community derived from runaway slaves who eventually integrated into American Indian culture. The Seminoles were unconquered people, descendants of just 300 Indians who had resiliently and very fiercely refused capture by the US in the 19th century. They were mostly Gullah fugitives who escaped from the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, who joined with the newly formed Seminole groups, who also had broken away from the Muskogee or Creek people. Both groups were fleeing the decimation of their cultures and people by European-brought violence and disease, and sought refuge in the Florida forests. Today, more than 2,000 of them live on 6 reservations in the state, located in Hollywood, Big Cypress, Brighton, Immokalee, Eft, Pierce, and Tampa. Seminole history begins with bands of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama who migrated to Florida in the 1700s. Conflicts with Europeans and other tribes had caused them to seek out new lands where they could live in peace. Groups of lower Creeks had moved to Florida to get away from the dominance of upper Creeks. Some Creeks were searching for rich new fields to plant corn, beans, and other crops. For a while, Spain even encouraged these migrations to help provide a buffer between Florida and the British colonies. The Seminoles had built their own settlements on the Florida frontier, fought a series of wars to preserve their freedom, and were scattered across North America. They have played a significant role in American history, but never did receive the recognition that was due them. Get ready to dive into a tale of resistance, resilience, and a powerful alliance that rewrites what you thought you knew about American history. Do not forget to like, share, and better still, subscribe to stay with us. This is going to be an interesting ride. Africans have a more than 400-year history in Florida, beginning with the Spanish exploration of the coast and the St. Johns River. The first Africans to reach Seminole County could have been among the early Spanish explorers of the St. Johns River, and certainly were among the escaping plantation slaves of the British colonial years and the later American expansion in the southeast. Some Gullah slaves, which is what they're also called, managed to escape. From coastal South Carolina and Georgia, south into the Florida Peninsula. In the 18th century, Florida was a vast tropical wilderness covered with jungles and malaria-ridden swamps. The Spanish claimed Florida, but they used it only as a buffer between the British colonies and their own settled territories farther south. They wanted to keep Florida as a dangerous wilderness frontier, so they offered a refuge to escaped slaves and renegade Indians from neighboring South Carolina and Georgia. The Gullahs were establishing their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness by at least the late 1700s. They built separate villages of thatched roof houses surrounded by fields of corn and swamp rice, and they maintained friendly relations with the mixed population of refugee Indians. In time, the two groups came to view themselves as parts of the same loosely organized tribe, in which blacks held important positions of leadership. The Black Gullahs had adopted Indian clothing, while the Indians acquired a taste for rice and appreciation for Gullah music and folklore. But the Gullahs were physically more suited to the tropical climate, and possessed an indispensable knowledge of tropical agriculture. And, without their assistance, the Indians would not have been able to cope effectively with the Florida environment. The two groups led an independent life in the wilderness of northern Florida, rearing several generations of children in freedom, and they recognized the American settlers and slave owners as their common enemy. The Americans called the Florida Indians Seminoles, from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, and they called the runaway Gullahs Seminole Negroes, or Indian Negroes. Something very interesting was occurring within the interior of Florida throughout the 1700s and early 1800s. Villages of Creek Indian farmers drifted into uninhabited parts of Florida during this period, They had little contact with the Spanish authorities in St. Augustine. The Spanish didn't dare try to evict the Creeks because of their past unpleasant experiences in combating them. The last time the Spanish tried to invade the Creek nation in 1703, they left behind around 600 bodies lying on the battlefield. The Creeks did not adopt Spanish traditions or religion. These Creeks in Florida eventually became known as Seminoles because they did not have strong political connections with the Creek provinces to the north. However, even as late as 1776, the Seminoles were merely considered a division of the Creek Confederacy, not a separate tribe. This is how botanist William Bartram described his contacts with the Seminoles in 1776. Simultaneously, Africans had continued to escape from plantations in the southern colonies and sought refuge in Florida. It was much easier for the African slaves to escape farms and plantations along the interior frontier because there were virtually no law enforcement officers in these regions. Of course, the Creeks had a long history of sedentary living and well-planned towns, but the Africans had often been treated as little more than livestock by planters. One of the many delusions held by white planters was that Africans were incapable of surviving without the management of white people. Almost immediately after gaining their freedom, the Africans began establishing orderly, clean villages and planting crops in northern Florida. They developed local governments, modeled after those of the Creeks. However, the absorption of Native American culture went far beyond politics. The Africans had switched to wearing Creek clothings. They had also learned to speak the Itsate Creek language instead of either English or African. Itsate was the predominant language of South Carolina and Georgia Creeks. What is even more surprising is that the Black Seminoles also adopted the Creeks' ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's Temple, and also the Samaritan sect today. Unlike some other monotheistic religions, Creek and Black Seminole women were equal to the men in all ways. In fact, the women owned most of the real estate. However, under the conditions of liberty in Florida, the Black Seminoles flourished. U.S. Army Lieutenant George McCall recorded his impressions of a Black Seminole community in 1826. This, he had said, "We found these Negroes in possession of large fields of the finest land, producing large crops of corn, beans, melons, pumpkins, and other esculent vegetables. I saw, while riding along the borders of the ponds, fine rice growing, and in the village large corn cribs were filled, while the houses were larger and more comfortable than those of the Indians themselves." The remote regions of Seminole County were sanctuaries for many Africans, the allies of the Seminoles during 3 wars and hostilities during the early to mid-1800s. Along the sparsely populated regions of the St. Johns River, blacks became accomplished woodsmen, hunters, and fishermen. Some became prominent leaders as well as guides and interpreters. They used plantation-learned skills to farm and build shelters. The United States, which acquired Florida in 1821, moved army troops and supplies along the St. Johns and other rivers during its campaigns against the Seminoles and their black allies. Many of these people originally had been captured from African fighting tribes. The Seminoles welcomed them as capable warriors and skilled farmers, and allowed them to form their own villages. Many too would be sent to the reservations west of the Mississippi River. From their ranks, the U.S. Army had later on recruited the Buffalo Soldiers of Western law. For the most part, Seminoles and Africans were more like allies against common threats. The U.S. Army, planters, slave hunters, and growing waves of new settlers that led to generational warfare just before slavery split the nation into North versus South. Now let's get down to the basic gist. After the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, Spain regained control of Florida from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. When the British evacuated Florida, Spanish colonists, as well as settlers from the newly formed United States, came pouring in. Many of these new residents were lured by favorable Spanish terms for acquiring property, called land grants. Even Seminoles were encouraged to set up farms, because they provided a buffer between Spanish Florida and the United States. Escaped slaves also entered Florida, trying to reach a place where their U.S. masters had no authority over them. Instead of becoming more Spanish, Florida increasingly became more American. Back when Britain controlled Florida, the British often incited Seminoles against American settlers who were migrating south into Seminole territory. These old conflicts, combined with the safe haven Seminoles provided black slaves, caused the U.S. Army to attack the tribe in the First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, which took place in Florida and southern Georgia. Forces under General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, attacked several key locations, and pushed the Seminoles farther south into Florida. Finally, after several official and unofficial U.S. military expeditions into the territory, Spain formally ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, according to terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Damn it! These people were betrayed first by the Spaniards, who never for once cared for the consequences that would befall those whom they'd used as buffers for so many years. However, the Seminole settlements in Spanish Florida had kept increasing as more and more runaway slaves and renegade Indians escaped south, and conflict with the Americans had become, sooner or later, inevitable. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson would lead the American army into Florida to claim it for the United States for good. And in doing this, the Seminole War finally erupted. As soon as the United States acquired Florida, it began urging the Indians there to leave their lands and relocate along with other southeastern tribes to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Some Seminole leaders signed a treaty in 1832, and part of the tribe moved. But other Seminoles refused to recognize the treaty and fled into the Florida Everglades. The black Seminoles and Indians fought side by side as military allies throughout the bloody Seminole Wars, in a desperate struggle to stop the American advance. Andrew Jackson had referred to this First Seminole War as an Indian and Negro War. The thing was, the US government had also planned to rid Florida of Seminoles and capture Africans who had fled American plantations and found sanctuary among the Seminoles in the former Spanish colony. The Seminoles, too, had fled to Spanish Florida after wars and conflicts among rival Creeks of the American Southeast. Andrew Jackson, first as an American general and later as president, pushed a policy of removing all of the tribes to remote land, west of the Mississippi River. The Seminoles resisted the drive to push them into western lands occupied by Creeks, whose slaves were treated much the same as those on American plantations. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the U.S. government attempted to relocate Seminoles to Oklahoma, causing yet another war, the Second Seminole War. The Treaty of Payne's Landing, signed by a small number of Seminoles in May 1832, required Indians to give up their Florida lands within 3 years and move west. When the U.S. Army arrived in 1835 to enforce the treaty, the Indians were ready for war. As Major Francis Dade marched from Fort Brooke toward Fort King, 180 Seminole warriors led by Micanopy, Alligator and Jumper attacked. Only one man of that army detachment survived the ambush. The campaigns of the Second Seminole War were an outstanding demonstration of guerrilla warfare by the Seminoles. The Micos Jumper, Alligator, Micanopy and Osceola, leading less than 3,000 warriors, were pitted against 4 U.S. generals and more than 30,000 troops. The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, usually referred to as the Seminole War proper, was the fiercest war waged by the U.S. government against American Indians. The United States spent more than $20 million fighting the Seminoles. The war left more than 1,500 soldiers and uncounted American civilians dead. And the obvious duplicity of the U.S. government's tactics marred Indian-white relations throughout the country for future generations. As the hostilities dragged on, frustrated U.S. forces increasingly turned to desperate measures to win the war. For example, Osceola was captured and imprisoned when he met with U.S. troops who had called for a truce and claimed to want to talk peace. With Osceola in prison, the United States was confident the war would end soon, but it did not. Although Osceola died in prison in 1838, other Seminole leaders kept the battle going for a few more years. In 1842, a nominal end to the hostilities arrived, though no peace treaty was ever signed. By this time, most Seminoles had been moved from Florida, relocated to Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. A third Seminole War broke out in 1855, when conflicts, largely over land, arose between whites and some Seminoles who remained in Florida. Constant military patrols and rewards for the capture of Indians had reduced the Seminole population to roughly about 300 remaining in Florida when the Third Seminole War ended in 1858. These ones hid in the swamps for over a decade. The black Seminoles waged the fiercest resistance, as they feared that capture or surrender meant death or return to slavery.